Welcome back to Advanced Theoretical Conjuration. For our new students, I'm Professor Ilansa Coriath, and I have met most of you through letter correspondence, so I know you have all already prepared for this class beforehand despite entering it mid-term. So, since everyone is already familiar with all the material we have covered thus far, I say we get right to it. Everyone, please refer to your readings when necessary. I will simply pick up where we left off. As we were discussing earlier, some of the most radical criticism coming out of Sigil today is the result of an interested desire to conserve the subject of Aeolian Empire, or the Aeolian Empire as subject. The theory of a pluralized subject effect gives an illusion of undermining subjective sovereignty, while often providing a cover for this subject of knowledge. Although the history of the empire as subject pretends it has no geopolitical determinations, the much publicized critique of the sovereign subject thus actually inaugurates a subject. We will argue for this conclusion by considering a text by two great practitioners of the critique, Jarl and Mierstrid. Although one of its chief presuppositions is the critique of the sovereign subject, the conversation between Jarl and Mierstrid is framed by two monolithic, anonymous subjects in revolution, the ahistoric and the historic multi-mundane. Intellectuals, however, are named and differentiated. Moreover, an ahistoric multi-mundane is nowhere operative. Transmundanism here simply creates an aura of narrative specificity, which would be a harmless rhetorical banality were it not that innocent appropriation of the proper name multimundanism for the eccentric phenomenon of the Sigic intellectual mundanism, and the subsequent New Old philosophy symptomatically renders mere theology transparent. The challenge Jarl poses to Mierstrid's interpretation of the Nustra verses demonstrates how familiar the young members of the Sigic movement are with scholarly arguments, and the remarkable dexterity they exhibit when using canonical sources to establish an argumentative point. Jarl's objection to the Pala argument for avoiding necromancy, for example, invokes principles of both Nustra verse about the narrator's fear to counter Jarl's claim that he has pure intentions and therefore does not need to avoid deliberation with experienced magisters like himself. Jarl is quick to point out the inapplicability of these verses to the conduct of theoretical mages. In this, Jarl implicitly invokes a well-known principle of the Nustra exegesis, known as agia halia ne jorain emera laloria, which magisterial jurists have used to determine the scope of a particular verse commands in light of the conditions under which it was revealed, such as the immediate ends it served or to whom it was addressed. Following this principle, Jarl argues that the Nustra verses that require a visual separation between mundus and oblivion were directed at the Aeolian magisters and therefore do not pertain to ordinary mages. He further buttresses his argument, by citing a well-known essay in which the writer advises wizards to distinguish between transmundane phraseological discrepancies that are specific to Nustra and his kin, and those that apply to mages in general. Note that in making these counter-arguments, Jarl does not challenge the principle of magical conservation and drainage as divinely ordained, but contests the scholar's ideas regarding how this principle should be addressed in practice. A purposeful example of such radical testimony is the highly lauded yet controversial studies of Calaman Way of Alinor, as suggested in her treatise Liminal Bridges, which reads as follows. Transliminal passage of quickened objects or entities without the persistent agency of hyperagonal media is not possible, and even if possible would result in instantaneous retromission of the transported reference. Only a transportine circumpenetration of the limen will result in transits of greater than infinitesimal duration. Though other hyperagonal media may exist in theory, the only known transliminal artifact capable of sustained transportine circumpenetration is the Sigil Stone. A Sigil Stone is a specimen of pre-mythic quasi-crystalline morpholith that has been transformed into an extra-dimensional artifact through the arcane inscription of a Daedric sigil. Though some common morpholiths, like soul gems, may be found in nature, the exotic morpholiths used to make sigil stones occur only in pocket voids of oblivion and cannot be prospected or harvested without Daedric assistance. Therefore, since both the morpholiths and the Daedric sigils required for hyperagonal media cannot be obtained without traffic and commerce with the Daedra lords, it is necessary that a transliminal mechanic cultivate a working knowledge of conjuration through purpose-built enchantments that may be substituted if the mechanic has sufficient invocatory skill. Traffic and commerce with Daedra lords is an esoteric but well-established practice and lies outside the compass of this treatise. Interested students are invited to consult the works of Albrecht Theophanes Bombidus and Galerion the Mystic for the fundaments of this discipline. Recommended examples of the Conjurational Charter may be found in Therion's Book of Most Arcane Covenants or Ralibala's Elven Ritual Forms. What happens to the critique of the sovereign subject in these pronouncements? The limits of this representationalist hyperagonal realism are reached with Tos il Anselmas on Arteum, which reads as follows. The Elder Way is a philosophy of meditation and study said to bind the magical forces of nature to the individual will. It differs from magica in origin, but the effects are much the same. That being said, it is perhaps more than coincidence that the Isle of Arteum literally vanished from the shores of Somerset at the beginning of the Second Era at about the magical time of the funding of the Mages Guild. So much for the intermediate group marked under Statute 4. For the true subaltern group whose identity is its difference, there is no unrepresentable transliminal subject that can know and speak itself. The intellectual solution is not to abstain from circumpenetration. Galerion, like Camelon Way, speaks of interest in terms of the ahistoric rather than the libidinal being. The Aedra over Daedra imagery in the old Eddas can help emphasize that on the level of mortal or quasi-mortal subaltern group action, true correspondence to own being is as artificial or social as the patronymic. So now that we have that straightened out, we can move on to our next subject, which is limited conjuration. Limited conjuration is a branch of arcana invented in the Second Era by I. Azaphon and Skag Laforiel amid controversies of continental proportions. First, there was an acrimonious question of precedence, which took a long way to settle. It is now accepted that the two founding fathers made the discoveries independently, with Azaphon being the first to come up with some basic ideas, while Lyrafel was the first to publish his results. To Lyrafel we also owe the common notations nowadays used in limited conjuration and the term limited conjuration itself. But the story is not a pretty one. Second, the fundamental notion of an infinitely or indefinitely minor summons, the infinitesimal in other words, was assumed to have such strange properties, like sometimes being positive and sometimes being non-positive, that the best contemporary minds refused to accept the emergent methods. The forefathers have been driven by their intuition, and the final results of their methods were indisputably correct. However, the methods themselves were suspect. The revulsion to the new ideas seeps in through Wex Crestus's Fourth Era essay, The Limited. Here is an overused quote. And what are these fluxions, the velocities of evanescent increments? And what are these same evanescent increments? They are neither finite quantities, nor summits infinitely minor, nor yet nothing. May we not call them the ghosts of departed quantities? As an example, let's find the necessary derivative of psi, derivative, excuse me. Let's find the necessary derivative. Psi of psi equals chi to the second. Assuming O to be a minor but active summons, psi plus chi to the second minus psi to the second divided by O is equal to psi to the second plus 2 psi chi plus O to the second minus chi to the second divided by O. So let's write that down. Divided by O is equal to psi to the second plus 2 psi chi plus O to the second minus, there we go, over O is equal to 2 psi chi plus O to the second divided by O is finally equal to O to the second. By setting O to the first level of oblivion, we conclude that psi is equal to psi chi, which is a meaningful and, in fact, correct result. But according to Crestus, it has been derived by both letting O to be active and inactive in the same breath. This he justly found utterly objectionable. Both founding fathers made mistakes. For example, in the Ellenven reading, page 246, Leforia believed, albeit briefly and before the result had been published, that rho chi tau is equal to rho chi times rho tau, while Azophon faked a proof that of the product rule in his Philosophae Arcanum, third era. Both forefathers based their derivations on geometric considerations, although their intention was to introduce a novel way of performing conjurations with variables. In the late Third Era, as the problems grew in complexity, limited conjuration indeed became more resolvable and since is often described as arcane resolution. So what is limited conjuration? Limited conjuration is the branch of magic that defines and deals with limits, necessary derivatives, and components of cross-planar momentums. It is often divided into two parts: existential limited conjuration, dealing with necessary derivatives, i.e. rates of change and tangents, and component limited conjuration, dealing with components, i.e. areas and sigils. Existential equations that use methods from both grew into a separate discipline, actually more than just one, as did limited conjuration of variations. As a way to illustrate the evolution of limited conjuration, I shall list several quotes plucked from Anathor's book that demonstrate the attitude of various authors from the notion of infinitely minor and the related notion of limit. By infinitely minor, we understand something indefinitely transformative, so that each conducts itself as a sort of class, and not merely as the last thing of a class. Anyone wishes to understand these, the infinitely minor, as the ultimate things, it can be done, and that too, without falling back upon a controversy about the reality of extensions or of infinite continuums in general, of the infinitely minor, even though he that thinks such things are utterly impossible. There is no doubt that any summons can be diminished until it all but vanishes and then goes to nothing. But an infinitely minor summons is nothing but a vanishing summons, and so it is really equal to non-existence. There is really not such a great mystery lurking in this idea as some commonly think, and thus have rendered the limited conjuration of the infinitely minor suspect to so many. The summons, to which the ratio Xi-Tau approaches more and more closely if we suppose Xi and Tau to be active and decreasing. Nothing is clearer than that. When the significance successfully attributed to a variable approach indefinitely to positive significance in a manner so as to end by differing from it by as little as one wishes. This last is called the limit of all the others. Limit phi is greater than pi zeta equals zeta if and only if, for every iota above oblivion, there exists a factor greater than oblivion, so that if the plane of oblivion is less than 1 times zeta minus zeta pi is less than this factor, then iota zeta pi minus pi is less than the magical force of mundus. The latter is the notorious mundus above oblivion definition of limit that completely avoids the reference to any conduct of a variable or to any change that it may overgo with magica. It is surely a far cry from the uncritical use of infinitely minor that characterized the early years of limited conjuration. Gisargor's definition of limit appeared to finally nail the coffin of the departed summonses and led to a complete abandonment of the original idea of infinitesimals. However, in the Fourth Era, the ghosts have been resurrected by Vela River and placed on the sound foundation of the non-standard magica, thus vindicating the intuition of the Founding Fathers. To give the flavor of what Vela River has eventually come up with, here's her statement. Limit pi is greater than zeta epsilon by iota is equal to tau if tau by rho is infinitely close to phi, wherever phi is not equal to tau is infinitely closer to zeta. The advent of modern blade binding theory, incorporating the concepts of symmetry breaking and destabilization fields, radically changed the understanding of fields. The alchemical interaction of soul charge particles in particular would be interpreted in terms of local as opposed to global blade binding theory within the framework of limited conjuration. Interpreting the alchemical field as a local blade binding field takes into account the existence of positive and negative soul charges and gives a good representation of the alchemical magical forces. It also gives us a concept of the electric field somewhat more enlightening than the classical one, where the field is defined as the ratio of the magical force on test soul charge to the soul charge and the limit that the soul charge goes to zero. The key concept for representing the alchemical magical force as a blade-binding field is the recognition that the outphase of a particle's element function must be treated as a new physical 8 degree of non-bound dependent on the particle's mundus magica position. The four-dimensional morphology potential plays the role of a connection relating the outphase from point to point. Thus, the morphology potential becomes the fundamental field for arcanism. The Gisargor and time effect is generally cited to prove that this potential can produce observable effects, thereby confirming its reality. The blade-binding principle, as it is often called, is well illustrated by considering the non-relativistic River equation in the context of arcanism. It is also possible to give a relativistic version of the argument that appears below. The River equation for a non-bound particle is not invariant under the local outphase transformation. To be invariant under such transformation, the non-bound particle River equation must be modified so that it no longer represents a non-bound particle, but rather one moving under the influence of a magical force. For the case of arcanism, the non-bound particle River equation must be replaced by where and phi transform according to this point when the essence of the blade binding principle is that demanding invariance under a local outphase transformation corresponds to the introduction of a magical force. Of course, one can argue in the reverse. The introduction of a magical force can be represented as a local outphase transformation. A simple example will be given below. A non-bound particle at rest samples a sigil of mundus at least as large as its analytic element power, and the element function associated with the sampling is such that a spherical sigil is sampled in the absence of external magical forces. One might think here of a Daedric packet, the lowest order element function for the simple harmonic oscillator, which has the property of minimizing the uncertainty in both zeta and pi, thereby giving the maximum stability possible. I believe that covers it for today. If anyone has any questions for me about the reading or about anything else, I keep very irregular office hours, so tough luck finding me. Thank you. You are dismissed.